I want to talk about faking fossils. Any paleontologist that's trained at the university level is aware of the commerce in synthetic or fake fossils. It's a common thing. So we could call it faking fossils for fun and profit. We could also call it, for reasons you will see, the lying stones of Marrakesh. So we start out to give you some perspectives on fakes and replicas. Here we've got a picture on top of the Porsche Spyder, built in 1955. Today, this vehicle, there were only 500 of these vehicles made. It's a race car. They do sell for between $3 and $5 million, all right? So below is what we call a replica, which this was built, the replica down below. You can buy it for about $30,000, and it was built in 2015. That replica has a performance, sports car has a performance very near the 1955 model. So it's a copy. The real thing's on top, the one below is a copy or replica. And you have to ask yourself, would you use a $3 million car as your daily driver? Certainly not. So sometimes replicas are a good thing. Another example of the same thing is Elizabeth Taylor here. And above her head is the Hope Diamond, which was presented to her by Richard Burton, her husband. That diamond was almost never worn in public by Elizabeth Taylor. It was too valuable. So an exact copy, a replica, or if you wish, a fake, was created for her to show people or to wear in public. Which is, again, a wise thing to do, because you could just snatch it off her neck if you were somewhere you could get to it. Sometimes, on the other hand, replicas and fakes carry serious consequences. When my grandson was about 5 years old, he and a friend started making copies of $10 bills on a colored Xerox. And I said, no, you can't do that. And he informed me, this 5-year-old child said, he informed me, well, as long as you don't try to pass the money, it's okay. I said, no, you can't even copy him. It is a serious, serious offense in this country. A very famous fake fossil, which came out, was started in 1912. An archaeologist, Charles Darwin, created an amalgam where he put a human skull, a modern human skull, and the mandible of a modern orangutan together. He constructed this fraud. He put it in a quarry pit, and then he allegedly dug that out, and it was called Piltdown Man. The town was close town was Piltdown. But it was for almost 40 years, a little over 40 years, until 1953. This was a mystery. But in 1953, they figured out how to use carbon-14 to radiometrically date things. And they dated the skull, and they also dated the mandible. And both of them were only about 25 years old. So it couldn't have been a fake. But this was a very famous fake, Piltdown Man, in Britain, 1912, and it was uncovered or exposed in 1953. Dawson didn't quit. Dawson had another fraud that he did out in the chalk cliffs of Dover. There are these flint nodules, and this is a geode where he's allegedly found a mummified toad. We call it toad in a hole, but it was alleged to be preserved inside a flint nodule. And anything we know about construction of fossils and how they occur and how they develop, something like this just couldn't happen. Preserved toad inside of a flint nodule, quite impossible. So Dawson was out doing this stuff. Another facsimile or fake was done by a paleontologist named Dale Russell. He ran a museum in Canada, and he said, what if the dinosaurs had not turned into birds? What if instead the dinosaurs had evolved into a bipedal hominid, like a man? Well, that's no more strange than having dinosaurs evolve into birds. But he created, just for the fun of it, he created this thing we call a Dinosaur Man, which stood about 5.5 feet tall. And the people came to the museum to see this thing. They knew it was a replica, it was a fake, from Dale's fertile imagination. It was a kind of an interesting process, but he created this thing, and it got quite famous. But it was actually it never did exist. You can actually still see this in this Canadian museum, where they have a lot of dinosaurs. Another fraud that was uncovered or discovered in 1869, right after the Civil War, was what they call the Cardiff Man, also called a Cardiff Giant, a 10-foot high, long, carved body of a man. Was a splendid fraud. And you could pay a fee to view this thing, a huge carved giant, which was made by a man. It was carved from a 10-foot block of gypsum, which is in that case alabaster, a variety of gypsum called alabaster. It was called the Cardiff Giant because again it was over 10 feet tall, and it was, when it was carved, was shall I say, anatomically correct, which greatly added to the sensation. So they exposed this thing and it was put into, you could see it for a fee. P.T. Barnum, this thing became so famous that P.T. Barnum of Barnum and Bailey offered to buy the Cardiff Giant for $50,000. He wanted to display it too, but the owner refused to sell it because he was making too much money with his own. So Barnum had an exact copy or replica made, which he had carved. Then he displayed that and he called it the real Cardiff Giant. So as I say here, in effect, P.T. Barnum produced a fake of a fake, but it was eventually uncovered. In Britain in the 1800s, in the middle 1800s, the church determined to show that there were no such thing as fossils, particularly fossil ammonites. They took these ammonites and they carved snake heads on the end of the ammonite here, carved a kind of a snake head, and they made it like the snake head was a coil, the ammonite was a coiled snake. But again, these are still in museums. So it was kind of a desperate attempt to dispose of fossils at large, so that they were not to be some kind of a living form. But again, it didn't work. Another famous fraud, which took place in the early 1700s in Germany, when a professor, Joseph Barringer, began finding in a quarry nearby these pieces of shale or mudstone, which were hard, and they had these weird shapes. It's the ammonite here you see, the coiled ammonite, is very crude looking. It didn't look anything at all like an ammonite we see elsewhere. But he began finding the fossils on the right, insects and frogs and different kinds of shapes. He became quite excited because he thought these were fossils, and he collected hundreds of these shapes. He began finding these, students were putting these fake fossils in this quarry, and Barringer was coming along and collecting these things, and he wrote a book, rather a long book. These plates are out of that book, Lithostratigraphic of Iceberg Incis. The fossils themselves with time became increasingly fantastic. As I said, the plates here are from the hundreds of, he made a lot of copies of the book and sold it and began to make a little bit of money off of it. Finally, Barringer actually found his own name on the shales, written in Hebrew. And as I said, the game was up. And so he desperately set about trying to buy up and destroy any copies of his book. And he got most of them. But after his death, his relatives took surviving copies of the book, had it republished and reissued, and they sold it for a profit. So he failed. But it was Barringer's fake fossils. We call them the lying stones of Barringer. It's kind of a famous in history of geology. Stephen Gould, a Harvard professor, wrote a book that he whimsically called The Lying Stones of Marrakesh. Remember, there were the Lying Stones of Barringer. We just saw that. At this time when the book was written, fake fossils were being created in Morocco on a pretty good scale. In fact, they still are. They're produced and sold as real fossils. So Stephen wrote this composite book, several authors, and he just called it The Limestones of Marrakesh, kind of alluding to Barringer. So let's look at some of these fossils that are coming out of Marrakesh or out of Morocco. They're mass produced. If you look at these two specimens right here, this guy right here and this guy here, they're absolutely identical. You should never find identical fossils unless they've been cast like a mold. Also, I think this one right here is a copy of that one right there. They're exactly the same. So when you're mass producing something and they're exactly the same, again, something's definitely wrong. In this case, the fossils are fake, and these sell for several dollars each. More fossils out of Marrakesh, these little trilobites, which would be something maybe as much as 500 million years old, 500 million years old, allegedly. But all these trilobites you see here are exact replicas. They're all made from a mold, and they've been painted and molded and then painted with black paint very carefully. But when you see all these things the same, mass production like this, something is awry. Another slab from Marrakesh that came out. This case, we've got fossils from the Devonian, Silurian, and Ordovician. Several 100 million years of fossils in one slab. Quite impossible. So when you get several ages appearing on a single slab, something is wrong. And they got this little merry-go-round thing with the slab. It's about 1.5 feet across, but they sold for a lot of money. But this one had too many different ages on it. All right, a big problem with faking trilobites, we'll talk about more of them in a minute, is the fact that these creatures are great guide fossils. They'll tell you, we call them guide or index fossils. That means they are diagnostic. They're age diagnostic. And geologists routinely use these to determine the age of rocks. If you want to know if it's Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, we can get a pretty good idea by looking at the trilobites. What that means is that we know a lot about trilobites. They've been carefully studied because they're very important to the study of geology. So anytime there's a new species or taxa, it attracts a lot of attention, and that's what has uncovered these fossils. If you look at trilobites, this is an alternate genetic series from a juvenile down here. As it grows older, they grow up like this. There's several examples showing a complete life cycle of trilobites. The way these things function, their life cycle, is that they have an exoskeleton like a crab. They're a segmented arthropod. So when they grow, in order to grow bigger, they have to molt. And with each new molt stage, they add one section, and this is in the thorax right in here. They add a new section. So the juveniles down here only have a few of these stages or these segments, and as you get older, the number of segments increases. So the big adults have a large number of segments, the juveniles not so much. It tells you they're growing, and as they molt, they add a segment each time. We got another diagram from a paper showing in orange is the head or the cephalon, and the tail is green, the pygidium is green, but what we're interested in is this blue part we call the thorax. And from a juvenile up here, as we go into the life cycles to an older specimen here, we're just increasing the number of segments in the thorax. Older specimens have more segments. Well, if you're not aware of this perspective of biology on trilobites, you can make mistakes if you're faking trilobites. These trilobites all have the same number of segments regardless of their size. The biggest one should have more segments, fewer segments on this smaller specimens. But these all had the same number, so they are fake. These have been unmasked as fakes. If you look at this fossil, it's about 2.5 feet long. That's a monster size for a fossil. It's sold for around $700. And that's an interesting. To kind of get a perspective on this, I want to talk about something that happened in my own career. As a graduate student when I was in Michigan, I took a course in a biology course called Animal Behavior. One of the things that they study, a classic study, with seagulls and their preference for the egg. So if you look at a seagull, here's a seagull with her egg about this right size, and they hatch these eggs by sitting on them and so forth. But if you present the seagull a fake egg that is larger like this, she will abandon her own egg and try to hatch these. In fact, if you make it grotesque, something like this monster, The poor seagull will try to keep this egg warm. She will climb up on top of it. It's really hilarious to watch. It's kind of animal abuse, but the nesting gulls will go for this monster egg every time. The same is true with collectors. If they see a big trilobite, they can't resist it. So we take a fossil like this, just its size unmasks this thing as a fake. So we take and say that a lot of fossil collectors who buy fossils have been gulled by these grotesque specimens. All right, if you look at other Moroccan fossils that come out of there, you see something like this strange fellow. I have personally looked at and collected thousands of trilobites. I'm not a trilobite specialist, but if I get a chance, I do collect when I'm on a field trip. But I've never seen anything even close to this strange looking fossil. So I would label this a fraud. And if you peel back that blackish material, you can see that it's been painted on. Another one, a trilobite here, this particular species or taxon has some critical parts missing. The pygidium is incomplete and the cephalon is incomplete. So again, I would label this another fraud. They're not that hard to spot. Here's one that is probably the most popular fossil coming out of Morocco. This is a completely fanciful. Nothing is like this in nature. I've never seen anything like a real one like this. This has been created and created over and over and over again because it sells well. It's strange looking, long appendages on this thing, but it doesn't really look like a normal trilobite. So I call it a fake. Remember, with trilobites are confined to the Paleozoic era. And during the Paleozoic, the Atlas Mountains, where they're collecting these things in Morocco, were part of the Appalachians. The Atlas Mountains of Morocco were they were together with the Appalachians. So we've studied the Appalachian trilobites very, very carefully because we use them all the time as time markers. So when something bizarre like this species like this come out of Morocco, we get suspicious for good reason. Another one that didn't look quite right, and when you began to scratch it a little bit, you could pull the paint off of it, and this is also a fake. These are all out of Morocco. This fellow is actually a composite of it's a copy of the parts of 3 different species. They kind of merge these things together. And I know all 3 species, none of them are real. They've all been copied from real ones, and they kind of put the pieces together where they thought they went, but they don't work. This is a composite. So this is also a fake, in effect. To wind this up, at least the trilobites, this little guy, beautiful specimen, but it's a complete fake. And this thing, they don't exist like this in nature. They sell for a lot of money when they sell like this. But again, it's just a complete imagination. So I would call this a fake as well. Oh, another fake. Well, not quite. All right. So let's look at some fossil fish. These are from the Eocene Green River Formation of Wyoming, southwest Wyoming, a freshwater lake there around 50 million years ago, where fish are preserved on the bottom. But in this collage, each one of these little pieces have been put together. In this collage of fossil fish, there's even a skate here. A lot of them have been painted. They're completely faked. So there's one here that's been painted, created by a paintbrush, which is strange because we've either taken a fish that was there and enhanced it or actually created, painted one where none existed. This is strange because you could buy these little fossils. They're only about 2 or 3 inches long. You can buy them for $3 or $4. And it's not worth faking it, but they are quite frequently painted or enhanced or faked out of the Green River Formation. Sometimes when you start looking at fossils, you see something that's too perfect and has soft parts, like this little seahorse, which is a kind of fish. This kind of sets off alarms. And it really was unmasked as a fake as well. These echinoderms here are kind of a composite of what we call a brittle star, which is an echinoderm, and an asteroid, the true starfish. So then all these here are also fake. Okay, let's look at a real fossil. This is a frog, which is preserved in amber from the Dominican Republic. There's an Oligocene unit there, Oligocene unit, about 35 million years ago. When this was discovered, preserved in amber, this was sold for a little over $30,000, but it's worth a lot of money. So when you start seeing amphibians like this, these little salamanders on the left and right, these are both fake. And one of the first clues before they could get a microscope on them was that they were selling for $5. These were several thousand, something like that would be worth a lot of money to a collector, but they're not real. They've been faked. There were several ways we can pick these things up. In this case, they just aren't worth enough money. We fake reptiles like this fella out of China. These have been sold at amazing prices. They're cast from a real fossil, and then they're carefully painted, all complete like this, but they're not the real thing. Sometimes you look at fossils out of China, and this pair are perfectly symmetrical. Look at the vertebra and the ribs in the neck bone here, the thoracic, exact copies, all very symmetrically complete. Some soft parts preserved in here. Every little detail is complete and correct in here. And fossils just don't preserve that way. It's very rare. They should at least arouse your suspicion. And these were unmasked as also, they're artificial. They're not real. If we look at animals trapped in amber, when a spider or an insect is trapped in amber, or for that matter, in tar, like the La Brea tar pits, there's a terrific struggle to escape before it dies. And as a consequence, most animals or insects preserved in amber are contorted and even pulled apart, disarticulated. This is a real fossil, but you can see it's all twisted around as it was trying to escape this trap that was in. But usually they're almost never perfectly laid out if they're in amber, because they try to get away and it kind of twists them around. So if you look at fossils like this, perfect specimens of spiders here laid out, these are fake. They've been laid out. In the 1920s in Germany, between World War I and World War II, fake fossils of insects, spiders, and scorpions and the like, they were created on a large scale and they were sold. And the tip off to recognize these fakes was that they have completely unbroken, laid out specimens. Also, if you turn them up on their side, they lay the specimen on a piece of either amber or plastic, and then they pour plastic over it. You can see the two layers of plastic in the side. There's a kind of an interface in the embedding medium. You can actually see where they've been poured over and immersed in plastic. Again, these were producing these things with real cottage industry in the 1920s in Germany, but they're not hard to recognize. Another interesting one that came out of China was this giant spider, which is over a foot in size. Well, if you're afraid of spider, this is really a big spider. Actually, it wasn't a spider. This was a crayfish that somebody has scraped away the parts it didn't want it. You can see they've been scraped away here, and then they painted the appendages out here to make it into a spider. So a crayfish has been modified to make it worth quite a bit of money, but again, it's a fraud. This is a fake because one fossil is being turned into another. It was a fossil crayfish to be sure, but those aren't that uncommon. But something like this is really quite rare, a large spider like this. So if we start seeing original color on specimens like these beetles on the left, or perfectly laid out, beautifully articulated specimens like this nymph or this scorpion down here, they are an alert to you possibly have, or you're looking at a fake. They're just too good to be true. Sometimes we look at something like these dragonflies. Dragonflies don't preserve this way. There's something just looks wrong, something definitely wrong, the way they're preserved in here on a slab. These are also fake fossils. They're pretty good size. All right, in mythology, what we call a chimera is a mythological beast that constructed from parts of different animals. This particular one is constructed from a lion, a dragon, and a goat, of all three. We call this a chimera, one animal created from two or three or four, a winged lion or something like that. Okay, so we have what we call chimeras in the fossils. Here's a chimera, which is got, this portion is from a fish. The limbs here on the back and front are from a small mammal, and then the back was from a lizard. This is a real constructed from other fossils to make more money, but it is a chimera that's been faked or put together. This came out of China. Another fossil that came out of China not too long ago is a chimera, which is created for several pieces. And this actually got so far, it got a name. It's called Archaeoraptor, the old raptor or the old predator. And this was technically, it was sold as a feathered dinosaur, so it has kind of a feathered fat on these outside. But this was what I call a Frankenstein or a chimera, because the top part was from a fossil bird. The tail down here was from a fossil dinosaur, small dinosaur. And that's only about as big as a crow. And the limbs came probably from some kind of a rodent. So it's been put together as a, and they actually, it was named before they unmasked us as a fraud. As a consequence of this Archaeoraptor, anything that comes out of the feathered dinosaurs that are coming out of China, some of them are real, but when they come out, they're being treated with suspicion. And again, it's an organism about the size of a crow or larger. Archaeoraptor. Another fossil that is commonly faked are the jaw fragments, the mandible of a Cretaceous, about 100 million year old reptile, swimming marine reptile called a mosasaur. They're shown on the right. And you see these for sale, the mandible and the teeth. On the bottom is the real thing. This is, you can buy this. This is worth around $50 to $60 in a rock shop. This came out of the Niobrara Chalk in Kansas. They're pretty common there, and people collect these and sell them. When I examined these, a rock shop in this state, I examined some mosasaur mandibles and teeth. These are all from a mosasaur, most of them. 100% of them were fake. They were just painted on, kind of carved to look like teeth, and then the teeth were painted brown. So again, these are all artificial or fake fossils. And it's not hard to detect them if you get a real close look at them with a hand lens. Sometimes you see a creature that's just too bizarre to be believed. A couple of things here are synthetic fossils and just too weird. It's you say to yourself, this something is definitely wrong here. All right, is there any way to avoid fossil fraud? By the way, if you buy these things, the buyer has to beware. That's they're not selling them to. It's not you're committing a capital crime. But if you collect them yourself, you can probably avoid getting fakes. Okay, if you collect them, you bust them out of the rock yourself, you probably have the real thing. The other thing, you should know and trust the person who prepared them, whoever cleaned them out, whoever cleaned them, exposed them there, what we call the preparator. If you know that person, that's a good way to keep from getting a fake. And then we found that small specimens or multiple specimens on a slab. Look, this is a scale. The scale here is 1 inch in here. So this is a thing about the size of your fingernail or a baby's fingernail. These little trilobites here, Elrathia. This is a guide fossil. These are real fossils, but small multiple fossils on a slab are really hard to create and not worth the artist's time. Another thing does the same thing. Another trilobite. Again, the scale up here is 1 inch, so it's a really tiny little thing. A little trilobite out of the Cambrian, another guide fossil. Geologists use these routinely to identify the Cambrian period. But again, this is a real thing. It's several pieces. They're very tiny and very hard to fake these, but you have to prepare them a little bit to expose them. But these are not fakes. These are real things. Small fossils are hard to fake. Actually, anybody who's ever taken the pain to prepare a fossil can usually recognize a fake. You take a good look at it, scratches and so forth, and say, this is a fake or this is a real thing. Look at some real fossils like this, where you get several, really hard to do several at once like this, partly overlapping each other. These are real fossils. They've been beautifully prepared. You can see scratch marks on the rock here, but they've been brought up in detail. Beautiful fossils out of the Devonian. All right, so if you go back into Pablo Picasso, the artist, he would paint, he would do paintings and he'd sell these things. He was making a good living selling his paintings. And before he even died, people began to fake these things. They began to fake Picasso. Well, one of the things they would do, they bring these fossils, they bring these paintings to Picasso and say it. He'd look at it and said, no, that's a fake. He would identify them. He said, no, this is a fake. He identified these fossils, a lot of, pardon me, he identified these pictures as fakes. But finally, a man brought him a picture and asked him if it was fake. And he said, Picasso looked at it and he said, oh, yes, this is a fake. And that man said, wait a minute, you sold me this picture. It can't be a fake. And Picasso looked at him and said, you know what? Even Picasso occasionally fakes Picasso. Thank you. Can you start?